The music hall was filled with the soft hum of voices, the quiet shuffling of feet, and the faint smell of polished wood and cold air. The grand piano stood on the stage, black and shiny, catching the lights that reflected off its surface. Around it, a small group of students and observers gathered, all eager to catch a glimpse of the famous pianist who was about to practice. There was excitement in the room, a kind of nervous energy that made the air feel thick, almost tangible. Everyone wanted to see him play, to feel the power of his hands moving across the keys, and to be close to the talent that had made him a legend. In one corner of the room, far from the center of attention, sat a young woman. She was quiet, almost invisible in the crowd. Her hair was tucked behind her ears, and she wore simple clothes, nothing that would draw the eye. She carried a small notebook in her lap, filled with music notes she had written over the years. Her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the notebook, a habit when she felt nervous or out of place. She had been invited to watch, but no one seemed to notice her. No one spoke to her. It felt like she was a ghost, present but unseen. She didn't mind. She was used to being on the edges, to observing, to waiting. The famous pianist entered quietly, but the room seemed to brighten with his presence. He moved with confidence, his steps measured and deliberate. He was a man who had been surrounded by admiration for most of his life, and he carried it with him effortlessly. As he approached the piano, the students leaned forward, eager to catch every word and every gesture. Cameras clicked, and a few whispered questions were asked, but the pianist barely responded. His focus was on the piano, the instrument that had been his companion through decades of success. The young woman watched silently. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, all directed at him, and it made her stomach tighten. She remembered the first time she had played in front of anyone. She had been young, and the applause had felt overwhelming. But she had also felt small, like no one really saw her, only the music she produced. She understood the excitement in the room, the anticipation, the way people leaned in as if they could catch a secret by watching him. But she also understood the loneliness of being overlooked, having talent and yet feeling invisible. As the pianist sat down at the piano, the chatter in the room died down. He ran his fingers across the keys, testing them lightly, listening to the soft, perfect notes that floated through the hall. The young woman closed her notebook for a moment and leaned forward. She could hear the subtle movements, the small shifts of his hands, the way his fingers seemed to dance over the keys. He played a few simple scales, not yet a piece, just warming up. And still the room watched in awe. The students whispered among themselves, commenting on his technique, his posture, the way his fingers moved with precision and grace. But the young woman didn't whisper. She didn't comment. She simply watched, her eyes following the movement of his hands. She could see the confidence in his posture, the ease with which he commanded attention, and a small part of her felt a pang of envy. Not for fame or recognition, but for the way he could make people listen, how he could make them stop and pay attention without even speaking. She remembered the years she had spent practicing alone. The late nights, when the only sound was her own playing and the occasional creak of the house settling. She had spent hours learning to listen to music in a way that went beyond the notes. To feel it, to understand it, to let it flow through her fingers. But all of that had been private. Her music had never filled a room like this, had never made people stop and look. And yet she knew that the potential was there. Buried beneath years of quiet practice and self-doubt, the pianist began to play a familiar piece, one that everyone knew and expected. The notes were clear, strong, and beautiful, but there was a certain predictability to it. The young woman listened carefully, noting the subtle choices he made, the small nuances in tempo, the way he added emotion to the technical perfection. She could hear the skill, the experience, but also a kind of distance. It was as if the music was performed for others, for the audience, rather than coming from the heart. Her own fingers itched to play, to express the music that had lived inside her for so long. She knew the difference between performing for attention and performing from within. She had felt the rush of connection when a piece became more than notes, when it became a story, a conversation between her and anyone willing to listen. But she kept her hands still, reminding herself that she was here to observe, not to participate. She was a spectator, and the rules of this room demanded that she remain silent. A student hesitated at the piano, unsure how to continue a challenging passage. The pianist barely glanced at them, his expression unchanged. The student faltered, and a quiet murmur ran through the room. The young woman noticed, and something stirred inside her. She remembered how it felt to be in that position, to struggle with the music and feel the eyes of others judging you silently. It was a familiar ache, one she had carried for years. She shifted slightly in her seat, careful not to draw attention. Her mind wandered to the countless hours she had spent in similar positions, struggling with a difficult piece, learning from mistakes, and finding her own way. She thought of the teachers who had doubted her, the competitions she had entered and quietly lost, the friends who had moved on while she stayed behind, practicing alone. It was a life of small victories, often unnoticed, but deeply felt. The pianist continued, moving from one piece to another, each one more complex than the last. The audience followed along, captivated by the precision, the clarity, the beauty of the sound. The young woman closed her eyes for a moment and let herself imagine the music in a different way. One that was not about perfection or applause, but about connection and expression. She felt the music in her chest, in her fingertips, in the rhythm of her heartbeat. It was a private moment, but powerful, grounding her in the reason she had devoted her life to this art. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed that no one had looked her way. No one had asked her opinion. No one had acknowledged her presence. It was a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief, because she was free to observe, without pressure. Sadness, because it reminded her of how easily someone with talent could be overlooked. She had learned to live with that feeling, to accept it. But it never left her completely. The pianist paused, stretching his fingers and adjusting his posture. The room seemed to exhale collectively, a silent acknowledgement of the skill they had just witnessed. People whispered, comparing notes, commenting on the technique, praising the performance. The young woman listened, absorbing the sounds, the words, the reactions. She felt a quiet sense of longing, a desire to be part of that world. Even if only for a moment, she thought about the stories she had heard of musicians being discovered in unexpected ways, of talent hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine. She wondered if that could ever happen to her, if her years of quiet practice could lead to a moment where the world would pause and listen. She didn't expect it, but the thought lingered, small spark of possibility. As the pianist played the final notes of his session, the room erupted in applause. The young woman clapped politely, though her hands were trembling slightly. She felt a mix of emotions, immersion, envy, and a quiet hope that one day her music might be heard in a similar way. She looked down at her notebook, her fingers brushing over the pages filled with her own compositions. Each note represented a piece of her journey, a story she had kept to herself. Waiting for the right time to share, the crowd began to disperse, some staying behind to ask questions, others quietly discussing what they had seen. The young woman remained in her seat, letting the room empty around her. She felt the weight of the moment, the anticipation, and the quiet strength she carried inside. She knew that talent alone was not enough. Patience, courage, and the willingness to step forward at the right moment were equally important. She gathered her notebook and rose slowly, moving toward the exit. Her eyes lingered on the piano, the instrument that had shaped so many lives, the instrument that had the power to command a room. She imagined herself sitting there one day, her hands moving with confidence, her music filling the space, and the world pausing to listen. It was a dream she had carried quietly for years, a dream that felt both distant and achievable. As she stepped into the hallway, the sounds of the music hall faded behind her. She felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but she was ready to face them. She had observed, learned, and waited. Now, she would prepare to claim her own moment. The moment when her music could fill the room in a way that words never could. And for the first time in a long while, she felt that the world might finally notice her not just for what she could do, but for who she was and the music that lived inside her heart. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to a small, sunlit room filled with the smell of old wooden floors and dust dancing in the air. She remembered her first piano, a handmade down with keys worn smooth from years of practice by someone else, someone whose story she would never know. She had discovered it one afternoon when she wandered into the living room. Drawn by the strange beauty of the sound it made when a key was pressed, the music called to her mysterious and inviting, and she pressed her small fingers against the keys. The sound that came out was awkward at first, harsh and uneven, but she felt a spark of something she could not yet name. She was only 5, but she knew in that instant that this piano would change her life. She spent hours experimenting with the keys, learning to move her fingers gracefully, listening to the sounds she could create. Her parents were not musicians, but they noticed her dedication and encouraged her when they could. They bought her sheet music, took her to small recitals, and sometimes, when she played in the evenings, they would sit quietly, letting her music fill the home. Those moments were simple, ordinary, yet magical. She felt safe, accepted, and alive in the presence of music. As she grew older, her talent became more apparent. Teachers would comment on her natural sense of timing, her ability to express emotion through the keys, and her dedication to practice. She won small competitions, her fingers dancing across the piano as if they belonged there. She felt a growing sense of pride, a belief that her music mattered. And yet, life had a way of shifting her focus away from what she loved most. Her family faced hardships. Money was tight, and she was often needed at home. Her dreams of performing on grand stages had to be put on hold. She continued to practice when she could, but her music became private, something only she would hear. The piano in the corner of her room became both a friend and a refuge, a place where she could pour out emotions she could not speak aloud. She learned to find comfort in solitude, to let the music speak when words failed. School was not always easy. She was shy, often overlooked, blending into the background. Teachers would praise others for their performances while she remained unnoticed, her talent quietly hidden. It was not that she lacked confidence entirely, but she had learned to temper it with caution. She knew that even the best talent meant little if no one was there to see it, and so she practiced in secret, letting her music grow in silence. Unbothered by recognition or applause, she remembered one particular teacher who had taken an interest in her abilities. He had seen something others missed, and encouraged her to pursue competitions and recitals. For a time she felt seen, validated, and alive in a way that words could not capture. But life intervened once more, demanding that she prioritize responsibilities over passion. She had to step back from public performances, leaving behind the stage, the applause, and the excitement of being recognized. Music remained, but only as a private companion. Despite the setbacks, her love for the piano never faded. Every note she played carried the weight of her experiences, the moments of joy, sadness, frustration, and hope. Her fingers learned to move with a kind of memory, a way of translating emotion into sound. She could play entire pieces without thinking, letting the music flow naturally from her heart. She became her own teacher, critic, and audience. Discovering depths of skill and feeling that few ever witnessed, she remembered the small victories that had shaped her journey. The first time she mastered a particularly difficult piece, her hands trembling with the effort, her heart racing with accomplishment, the quiet pride she felt when she improvised a melody that sounded beautiful, even to her own ears. These moments were hers alone, precious and irreplaceable. They reminded her why she loved music, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the way it made her feel alive and connected to something larger than herself, even as she practiced alone. She was aware of the world outside. She would sometimes listen to recordings of famous pianists, marveling at their skill and artistry. She admired them, but she also recognized the difference between performing for an audience and performing from the heart. She understood that true music came from experience, from feeling, and from being fully present in the moment. Technique alone could not convey the stories she wanted to tell through sound. Her teenage years were filled with quiet determination. She balanced school, family responsibilities, and her practice, often sacrificing social events to spend hours at the piano. It was a lonely path, but it was hers. She learned to cherish small victories, to celebrate progress rather than perfection. She discovered that music had the power to teach patience, resilience, and the quiet strength needed to face life's challenges. Each note she played became a lesson in perseverance and self-expression. At times, she wondered what it would be like to perform on a stage, to have people listen and respond to her music. She imagined the lights, the audience, the collective energy of shared experience. It was a dream she carried quietly, tucked away among the many responsibilities and realities of life. She did not speak of it often, fearing disappointment or judgment. But the dream remained, a spark that refused to be extinguished. She thought of the moments when she had been underestimated or ignored. Teachers who overlooked her, peers who dismissed her abilities. In competitions where she quietly placed without recognition. Each experience left a mark, a reminder of how easily talent could go unnoticed. But these moments also strengthened her resolve. She learned to trust herself, to let her music speak in its own time. Recognition was not the goal. Expression was. Her practice sessions were filled with emotion. She played not just to perfect the notes, but to convey the feelings she carried within her. Joy, sorrow, hope, fear all found their way into her fingers and onto the keys. She discovered that the piano could be a mirror, reflecting her inner world in ways words never could. The music became a bridge between herself and the world, a way to communicate what she could not say aloud. As she grew older, her skills matured. She could interpret complex pieces with nuance, adding subtle variations in tempo and dynamics that brought the music to life. She learned to listen deeply, to anticipate the movement of the melody, and to let intuition guide her hands. Her music became expressive and personal, carrying the weight of her experiences and emotions. Yet, it remained largely unheard by anyone outside. Her small circle, the young woman knew that her journey had prepared her for moments that required courage. She had spent years developing not just skill, but resilience, patience, and self-belief. She understood that life might never offer her recognition in the conventional sense, but she had found fulfillment in the music itself. She had cultivated an inner strength that came from knowing her own worth. Even when the world seemed unaware, looking back, she could see the threads that connected her past to the present. The small hand-me-down piano, the quiet encouragement of her parents, the teachers who believed in her, the competitions that tested her, and the long hours of private practice, all had shaped her into the musician she was. Each experience, whether joyful or challenging, had contributed to the depth and richness of her playing. She carried this history with her. She returned to the music hall in her mind, imagining the room filled with students, critics, and the famous pianist. She thought about the years she had spent preparing, the countless hours of practice, the quiet determination that had kept her moving forward. She knew that the opportunity to play, if it ever came, would not just be about skill, but about conveying the stories, emotions, and experiences that had defined her journey. Her past had taught her patience, the kind of patience that allowed one to wait for the right moment without anxiety or resentment. She had learned that being overlooked did not diminish her talent, nor did it reduce the value of her music. Each note she played carried her story, her history, and her heart. And she knew, deep down, that one day her music might find its way to those who were ready to listen, who were willing to hear not just the notes, but the life behind them. Even in moments of doubt, she held on to hope. She knew that talent and opportunity were not always aligned, and that recognition could be delayed, but the music itself was constant, reliable, and true. She trusted that the years of preparation, the quiet hours of practice, and the resilience she had cultivated would guide her when the moment finally arrived. She understood that patience and readiness were as important as skill and passion. As she reflected on her past, she felt a sense of calm determination. The young woman knew that the journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been rich, meaningful, and transformative. Her experiences had shaped her into a musician capable of expressing depth, nuance, and emotion. She had learned to trust her own voice, to find fulfillment in the act of playing, and to value the quiet power of music as a means of connection. And so, she continued to dream quietly, nurturing the hope that one day her music would fill a room, commanding attention not through fame or recognition, but through the sincerity and power of expression. She understood that this moment would require courage, confidence, and the willingness to step forward despite uncertainty. But she also knew that she was ready. She had spent a lifetime preparing, even when no one was watching. And that preparation had made her strong, resilient, and patient. Her music was ready, even if the world had yet to hear it. The day came when she returned to the music hall, this time not only as an observer, but as someone who had been quietly invited to be present during the pianist's rehearsal. The hall was alive with energy, voices hushed in anticipation, and the grand piano sat like a dark jewel under the warm lights. She took a seat in the back corner, her notebook and pen at hand, but her focus was on the piano. She had rehearsed in her mind, imagined herself performing. But she knew the real moment, if it came, would be far different from anything she could envision. The famous pianist entered as usual, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Students and admirers whispered excitedly among themselves, discussing technique, asking questions, and hoping to catch a glimpse of his genius. The young woman sat quietly, listening, observing, letting the atmosphere wash over her. She could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken pressure to perform, to be perfect, to impress. She knew that pressure well, but she had learned to meet it with patience rather than fear. A small incident broke the rhythm of the rehearsal. One of the students stumbled through a difficult passage, pausing mid-piece, their fingers frozen above the keys. A hush fell over the room. The pianist glanced at the student, his expression calm but expectant. The student tried again, but uncertainty clouded their playing. The room held its collective breath, waiting for guidance. The young woman watched, recognizing the familiar weight of expectation. The way eyes and ears in the room seemed to press down on every note. She felt a flutter in her chest, a mix of nervousness and a strange kind of anticipation. Someone in the room, perhaps half-joking, suggested that the quiet woman in the corner try the passage. The words barely registered at first. She had not expected to be noticed, much less asked to play. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly, her heart beating faster. The suggestion hung in the air, a challenge disguised as a casual comment. She glanced at the pianist, who seemed indifferent, his focus still partially on the student, yet there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He did not speak or gesture. He simply waited. She rose slowly, clutching her notebook, and approached the piano. Each step felt heavy, filled with a mix of fear and determination. Her mind raced through the years of practice, the countless nights spent alone with the piano, the silent hours of learning and refining her skills. She had imagined moments like this before, but now that it was real, the uncertainty was almost overwhelming. Could she play perfectly? Could she express herself in a way that mattered? These questions pressed on her, but she pushed them aside. Focusing on the keys before her, her fingers hovered over the piano, light and tentative at first. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories of practice guide her. She felt the rhythm in her chest, the echo of melodies she had created in solitude. The room was quiet, and she could hear her own breathing. Now the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, and the collective anticipation of the people around her. She exhaled slowly and pressed down on the first key. The sound that emerged was soft, clear, and full of emotion. It was not flashy or dramatic, but it carried a sense of life and experience. She let her fingers move naturally, guided by years of unseen practice. The passage she had been asked to play was difficult, but her hands flowed across the keys with precision and grace. Each note spoke, not only of skill, but of emotion, of the hours she had spent learning to translate feeling into sound. The room seemed to pause, the air thick with attention. As the music filled the space, she became aware of the audience only indirectly, through the shift in energy around her. The whispers had stopped. The students, the observers, and even the famous pianist seemed to lean forward, listening intently. Their eyes were fixed on her hands, but she did not notice. She was immersed in the music, letting it guide her, letting it flow naturally from her heart through her fingertips. Each note was a statement, a story, a moment of her life shared without words. As she continued to play, her confidence grew. She remembered the nights she had spent alone, practicing difficult pieces until her fingers ached. The moments when she had thought she might never master a passage, and the triumph of finally succeeding. All of those experiences coalesced into a performance that was both precise and expressive. The room responded, though silently at first, to the honesty and depth of her playing. There was no applause yet, only attention, recognition that something special was happening. She could feel the subtle changes in tempo, the variations in dynamics that added emotion to each phrase. She allowed herself small flourishes, improvisations that reflected her personal style, her own interpretation of the music. This was not just a technical exercise. It was a conversation with the instrument, with the room, with everyone present. She felt connected, fully present, and alive in a way she had never experienced in public before. The famous pianist, who had been watching quietly, now leaned forward slightly. His expression shifted from indifference to curiosity, then to surprise. He had seen many students and performers in his career, but there was something different here. The music was not just technically correct, it carried a depth and authenticity that resonated. He watched as her fingers moved effortlessly, as the melody unfolded naturally, and he began to understand that this was not a simple display of skill, but a voice speaking through the piano. Around the room, observers exchanged glances. Some whispered softly, trying not to disturb the flow of music, while others simply sat, captivated by the unfolding performance. There was a sense of disbelief, a recognition that something unexpected and extraordinary was occurring. The young woman played on, unaware of the attention she was drawing. Focused entirely on the connection between herself and the piano, time seemed to stretch. Moments that would normally feel long passed quickly, each note flowing into the next, creating a seamless tapestry of sound. She could feel the emotion in the room, the subtle reactions of those listening, and she let it guide her. The music became more expressive, more personal, conveying not only the notes on the page but the years of practice, the struggles, the quiet determination, and the dreams she had nurtured in solitude. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with exhilaration. She realized that this was what she had been waiting for, the moment when her music could speak for itself. She did not need to prove anything to anyone, but she felt a deep satisfaction in sharing the emotions and stories that had lived inside her for so long. Each chord, each phrase was infused with meaning, and she could sense that it was being received, felt, and appreciated as the passage drew to a close. The room remained silent for a heartbeat longer than expected. There was a collective intake of breath, a moment of recognition and awe. The young woman lifted her hands from the keys, feeling a mixture of relief and quiet triumph. She had shared a part of herself that few had seen. She had done it with honesty and courage. The famous pianist finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight of respect. He acknowledged her presence and her performance, not with dramatic praise, but with a recognition that came from understanding the depth of what she had played. The students and observers began to respond as well, some with applause, some with stunned expressions, all with a sense of respect for the music that had just filled the room. The young woman felt a warmth spread through her, a mixture of pride, relief, and joy. She had taken the step forward, faced the uncertainty, and allowed her music to be heard. In that moment, she understood the power of patience, preparation, and the courage to act when the opportunity presented itself. She had waited for years, practiced in solitude, and now her music had found its place, commanding attention not through showmanship, but through truth and expression. As she stepped away from the piano, the room slowly returned to its usual hum of conversation and movement. People spoke in low voices, sharing impressions and reactions. The famous pianist approached her, his expression thoughtful and respectful. He asked a few questions about her approach, her training, and her experiences, genuinely interested in the musician before him. For the first time, she felt fully seen, not just for her skill, but for the person she was and the music she carried within. Walking back to her seat, she realized how much had changed in just a few minutes. The invisible corner she had occupied before now felt like a place of possibility. She understood that recognition was not always immediate, and that the journey to this moment had been as important as the performance itself. She had proven to herself that her talent, patience, and dedication were real, and that her music could indeed fill a room, even when she had once thought it might remain unheard forever. As her fingers moved across the piano keys, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. It was no longer just a rehearsal with students watching a master. The music began to take on a life of its own, growing richer, more expressive, and deeply emotional. Each note she played seemed to speak directly to the people in the room, reaching past the surface of mere sound to touch something more profound. The small murmurs that had filled the space before her performance faded into complete silence. Everyone was listening, fully absorbed, as if the world had been reduced to the music itself and the way it moved through the room. She was unaware of the effect she was having. Her mind was fully immersed in the music, in the sensations that flowed from her fingertips into the piano and out into the hall. She could feel the weight of every note, the depth of every chord, and the story each phrase carried. The years of practice, the hours spent alone perfecting her craft, and the emotions she had bottled up for so long were all converging into this moment. She was no longer just playing a piece. She was sharing herself, her history, her struggles, her triumphs through sound. The famous pianist, who had been watching quietly from the side, now leaned in, his eyes fixed on her hands. He had seen countless performers, but there was something different about this young woman. It wasn't just technical skill that she displayed. It was authenticity, the kind of expression that came from a life fully felt. His previous indifference melted away as he recognized the depth in her music, the way it carried her presence and her story. For the first time in the room, he was truly listening, not just observing a performance, but experiencing it. Around the hall, the students and observers were equally captivated. Their eyes widened as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some instinctively leaned forward, eager to catch every detail, while others simply sat, mesmerized, unable to move. There was a collective awareness that the performance was no longer about who had started the session or who was famous. It was about the young woman at the piano and the music that filled every corner of the room. Every note, every pause, every subtle nuance held them in thrall. She felt the room's attention like a gentle current, guiding her hands, helping her express the feelings that had been buried for so long. Her fingers glided across the keys with confidence, tracing the melodies that had lived inside her, waiting for a moment like this. She did not force the music. It came naturally, as if the piano itself were alive and breathing with her. She added subtle variations, small inflections, that reflected her own personality and experiences. It was her story unfolding in sound. And the room seemed to respond instinctively. The silence around her was profound, but it was not empty. It was filled with anticipation, emotion, and the unspoken recognition of something rare. People who had come expecting to see a famous pianist perform were now witnessing a different kind of mastery, one that spoke not just of skill, but of life, of experience, and of the heart behind the notes. They could feel the authenticity in every chord, the vulnerability and strength in every phrase. The young woman's music had become a bridge, connecting her to everyone present in a way that words could not. She reached a particularly complex section of the piece, one that required both technical precision and emotional depth. Her fingers moved effortlessly, guided by muscle memory and intuition, but her heart was fully engaged in every movement. She allowed herself to slow down slightly, letting certain notes linger longer, emphasizing the emotion in each phrase. The effect was immediate. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, as if the music itself were a living entity that demanded attention and respect. She could feel the energy in the room shift, becoming more intimate, more connected. The famous pianist's expression had changed completely. The subtle flicker of curiosity had transformed into focused admiration. He recognized the years of dedication, the resilience, and the quiet strength that had brought this young woman to the piano at this precise moment. He could see the story behind each note, the years of unseen practice, the patience, the struggles, and the triumphs. He understood that this performance was not about competition or recognition. It was about truth, emotion, and the pure, unfiltered power of music. The students in the room, too, were captivated in a way they had never experienced before. They had seen many performances, studied many techniques, and admired countless pianists, but none had moved them like this. They could sense the life behind the music, the depth of feeling, and the authenticity that could not be taught. Some felt their own emotions, stirred memories, hopes, fears, and joys, rising in response to the music. They had come to observe a master, but they had found themselves witnessing the emergence of a rare talent, a voice that could not be ignored. She was unaware of the effect she was having, lost in the flow of the music. Her body moved naturally, her posture relaxed, and her breathing synced with the rhythms she played. She allowed herself to be fully present, each note a reflection of her inner life. She felt the energy of the room not as pressure but as a shared experience, a silent conversation between her and the listeners. The music became a language, a way to communicate without words, a way to connect hearts and minds in a profound and lasting way. As she progressed through the piece, she added subtle dynamics, slight variations in tempo, and gentle accents that brought the music to life. It was not a performance aimed at impressing others. It was an honest expression of her experiences, her feelings, and her growth as a musician. The room responded instinctively, the silence filled with awe, respect, and a deep appreciation for the authenticity she displayed. It was a moment that transcended skill and technique, touching something fundamental and human in everyone present. The famous pianist finally moved closer. Drawn by the depth of expression he was witnessing, he watched intently, noting the fluidity of her technique, the confidence in her movements, and the emotional resonance of her performance. He had seen many talented musicians in his life. Few had the ability to convey such sincerity and depth through music alone. He could see that her playing was not simply a repetition of notes learned by rote. It was a living, breathing expression of her life and soul. Around the room, the energy continued to shift. Observers could no longer focus on anything other than the young woman at the piano. Their attention was complete, their admiration growing with every passing note. They felt the music not just with their ears, but with their hearts, as if it were telling stories they themselves had forgotten or longed to hear. Each phrase, each chord, resonated with the shared human experience, creating a connection that transcended age, experience, and expectation. She reached the climax of the piece, a section that demanded both technical skill and emotional intensity. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision, but they also conveyed passion, vulnerability, and strength. The room felt alive, vibrating with the music, as if the piano had become a conduit for something larger than any individual performer. She played with abandon, fully immersed in the moment, letting the music carry her and the audience together. Through the journey she had created, the famous pianist now stood in silent admiration, watching the young woman transform the room with her music. He had witnessed countless performances in his lifetime, but he had never seen someone command attention with such authenticity, depth, and grace. He recognized not just talent, but the culmination of years of dedication, resilience, and quiet determination. She had arrived at this moment fully prepared. The music reflected the entirety of her journey. As the final notes resonated through the hall, a hush fell over the room. The sound lingered, fading slowly, leaving a profound silence in its wake. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then, gradually, the applause began, first softly, then growing louder, filled with genuine admiration and respect. The young woman lifted her hands from the keys, her heart racing, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of accomplishment and connection. The famous pianist approached her, his expression one of respect and awe. He spoke softly, acknowledging the depth, skill, and authenticity of her performance. His words carried weight, not mere praise, but recognition of the person behind the music, the years of dedication, and the courage it took to step forward. The students and observers joined in, offering applause and admiration, their expressions filled with amazement and appreciation. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet triumph that went beyond recognition or praise. She had shared her music, her story, and her heart, and it had been received fully and deeply by everyone present. The experience left her feeling seen, validated, and connected in a way she had never imagined. The music had transcended technique, status, and expectation, creating a space where authenticity and expression reigned supreme.